Who's having a good time so far? I've heard a lot of really good stories, so. Okay, that makes me happy, so I'm glad. So this is our afternoon keynote for today, and I'm glad to be joined here by Sherry Lassiter and Sonya-Pryor Jones from the Fab Foundation. And we're going to just have a little conversation about what the work that the Fab Foundation is doing. So I just want to say really quickly, when we thought about the theme, the power of the network, we were thinking in our heads, okay, what are some of the really robust networks we have in the maker community? And really, one of the first that comes to mind is the Fab network. It's just very robust. It's global. It's growing at like some crazy rate. Like every time I talk to you, they're like, I don't know, 1,000 new labs or something. I don't know, but it's not quite that fast. But it does seem like it's really growing and thriving, and it's something that you look at the maker movement and its global reach, and you can't help but to see the impact that Fab Foundation and the Fab Labs are having around the world. And so it's just really exciting to have Sherry and Sonya. I don't think they really need that much of a introduction. So do you want me to? I can read your bio. No, okay, they're like ashamed. So you can read the bios and sketch, but really, I think you can see up there, the first question we really wanted to think about as we're sort of framing our discussion is really, this all comes down to, why are we here? Like, why are we here, at this conference? Why are we here coming together as a network? What does it mean, this power of the network? And so I guess my first question that I have, for Sonya and Sherry is really, why do you do the work you do? Why are you here? What does something like NOMCON mean to you? Why?
I'm super excited to be here. We are super excited to be here. Sonya is my partner in crime at the Fab Foundation. And I just wanted to say how impressed I've been this today and also yesterday with the sort of deep, thoughtful reflections that I'm hearing from this community, right? I don't think I think it used to be, for us, it used to be a little bit more about like, here's this cool thing I made, right? But now I hear the community really thinking and acting deeply to affect their communities, and I just want to tell you how special and important that is. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for being here. Sonya and I, we thought it would be nice to kind of ask the question, why are we here? And so we'll come back to this at the end, because as you ask us questions, I'd like you to start by telling us why you are here. But Sonya, why don't you say first why are you here? Why do you do this?
So good afternoon, everyone. First, though, for me, I have to just take a moment to pause, right? And so for those of you, depending on your walks of faith, if you haven't taken a moment just to be in thoughtfulness and prayer about the gentleman who got sick, please take the moment to do that. Take a deep breath. Because that's important too. So in terms of the why that I'm here and why I do this work, I'm an educator by training and have had a wonderful opportunity to work both in K12 and higher ed. The K12 piece was really accidental, or really me being a parent looking for something special for my own children. And for me, in our Fab Lab work and in the larger maker community work, it really is about democracy. And we like to use the term Neil coined when he started the Fab Lab work, democratizing digital fabrication. And for me, democracy is about access, right? And I found in the beginning of my career that there were a lot of people, young people, who were brilliant, who were great, who were really capable, but they did not have access to post-secondary opportunities because there were so many gaps in what they had not learned before they ever showed up to a college admissions office, for example. And so when I was first introduced to digital fabrication, it was about a decade ago when we were having a lot of conversations about STEM and trying to launch STEM high schools in Ohio. And for me, digital fabrication was another gateway opportunity, particularly for students of color and for women in public schools. And so for me, I do this work because I see it as a bridge and I see it as an opportunity maker. And I've seen some of that happen over the last couple of years, and I want to see a lot more of it.
And I'm not sure, I got into this in a very serendipitous way as well. I used to be a television producer, writer, director for documentaries, science documentaries, and I decided one day that didn't want to do that anymore, and kind of accidentally drifted into Neil's lab. I remember sitting down and being interviewed by him for an hour and a half for this job of being a program manager for the Center for Bits and Atoms. I was like, what is that, right? And I left his office after an hour and a half. I said, you know, that's the worst interview I've ever had, and I didn't understand half of what he said, and he called me the next day and offered me the job. So that was crazy, right? That was really wonderful. But in the years of working with him, early on, he allowed me the room to take his class called How to Make Almost Anything. And I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but it's a wonderful class that teaches you digital fabrication, electronics, programming, and it teaches you to make functional systems. And I walked out of that class and I was so empowered and so on fire because all of a sudden technology, I had access to technology, and I could use that technology to do good things, right? And so the reason I'm here is because I feel like we can use these wonderful tools for technology for great social impact and to improve lives and livelihoods right around the world. I mean, there's economic opportunity, there's social impact opportunity, and I think that's something that I'd love to see us all do. So that's why I'm here.
That's a good transition to one of the questions I have, which is, you talk about Neil Gershenfeld, who's the scientist at the MIT Center for Bits and Atoms, who gathered a bunch of incredible equipment together and said, I want to explore what it means to make anything at any scale, from the atomic scale up to human scale, and being able to communicate between the physical and digital domains. But that's different than having a worldwide network of Fab Labs that are impacting people's lives. So can you talk a little about the transition from this research vision of how we can manipulate the physical world around us through these tools to a network of empowerment through exploring how to create?
If you don't mind, I'm going to just show you like 2 or 3 slides that give you kind of an origin, tell about our origins a little bit, and it will hopefully address your question. So what we're going to do today is try and talk a little bit about the educational impact, the commercial sort of impact or opportunities, as well as the sort of social impact and opportunities, the .org, the .com, the .edu in essence. And as Kip said, you know, this came out of MIT's Center for Bits and Atoms. They got a grant back in 2001 from the National Science Foundation to kind of look at the merging of physical science and computer science, and what happens at that boundary where its meet bits, and the translation thereof. And he started to run, I think many of you have seen this slide, but this is sort of about the digital revolutions. We kind of went from from analog to digital communication, analog to digital computation, and now analog to digital fabrication. And that's sort of where we find ourselves in the midst of that era, or that phase of the digital revolution. At any rate, he, with this equipment that he put together and this great funding from the National Science Foundation, he put together these sort of Fab Labs, these small, a subset of the microns to meters, or from the nanoscale to the building scale kind of capabilities, and he put those in communities in the world to ask the question, if you could make almost anything, and you had access to the technology and the knowledge, what would you do as a community with that? And what we find in the Fab Lab Network and the maker community is that you're still answering that question in amazing, amazing ways for us, right? And for yourselves. And so, on the left here, you'll see what we did in the early days is we said, anybody who wants to be a Fab Lab has to have $100,000 worth of equipment and materials, and you have to have exactly the machines we tell you to, et cetera, which was a really bad idea, right? But what it did accidentally was, serendipitously, we kind of built this global infrastructure, right? And so now we have all over the world, we've got about 1,800 Fab Labs. I think we're almost at 2,000 in more than 100 countries. And through that, now we can share educational programs. We can share business opportunities and share files and ideas and collaborate on all sorts of programs and projects. So, and in a Fab Lab, we like to brag that you can make almost anything, right? Anything you can imagine, from a communication device to a solar house, right? I'm getting my devices mixed up here. All right. So this is interesting. So over the years, so the top map is the Fab Lab map. Somewhat recently, 1,800 labs in about 100 countries. And the bottom map is really where I think we're all going. The sort of division between, or the differences between, say, Fab Labs, maker spaces, hacker spaces is kind of going away, and we're now like in this place where we all kind of share many of the same tools and processes. And so the bottom map it's a few years old, but it shows about 5,000 maker spaces, Fab Labs, hacker spaces, and innovation hubs, and all of those spaces, or most of those spaces, have some of the same tools and processes and can collaborate. And so it really now becomes a global infrastructure of all of us, and you know, what we need to think about is how do we activate that and work together to make change, right? To make change in the world. So, let's see. Yeah, so that's just the background on sort of the Fab Lab Network. And now I'd love to talk a little bit, or have us talk about, or actually you can ask us about, but we have the .edu, the .org, and the .com. So what do you want to know about the network?
I actually, before we jump into the various different parts of the organization now, one of the early principles, the serendipitous revelations of having the $100,000 set of equipment, was the notion that you could go into any lab, any Fab Lab anywhere in the world and have the same set of tools. So the thing that you made in Ghana, you could fly to Peru and fabricate the exact same thing there, or share those files with people in Peru. What does that look like as we start to blur the lines between Fab Lab Network and the rest of the network, as Fab Lab becomes part of the broader network? Does that change that experience? And that will transition into some of the education questions and community questions.
Okay, so I think it's an interesting question, because I think some of it is very much driven by the network itself, right? And so there are all these conversations about networks and collaborations and ecosystems, right? And we're hearing all the terms. And all of us are seeking to fit in and be a part of something, right? Where we can share our expertise, but also where we can learn and work together. And I think the way it's manifesting itself looks different in different parts of the world and across the variety of organizing structures, right? Whether you consider yourself a part of a Fab Lab network or a larger STEM or STEAM ecosystem. And I think one of the lovely things that Sherry particularly brought to the Fab Lab network itself, right? You know, sort of there's the technological roadmap, and that was all Neil, but she won't say this herself, so I will, is really how do you follow the flow of the people, right? And so some of our best networks and organized systems that work really well over time because we're not dictating a lot of things to them. We're letting things naturally happen, and we're following the herd, if you will. And so I think that is a fundamental philosophy that she was able to bring, and that the network in general has embraced. And I see that in this community and a lot of the other communities that are doing this kind of work. I think another way that it's manifesting itself in a hard way is it's not just about the individual file or the individual piece of technology that you can share, but it's the ideas
and the big, BHAGs, the big hairy things that we're trying to solve, and we're using the technology and the human capital of all these spaces to do it. And so I won't jump ahead, but there are a number of our international projects, like we're all concerned about education. We're all concerned about the environment. And those things are playing out in different parts of the world differently, but at the core, they're about the same shared values that we have about making, the place where we live better, right?
I like that shared value. So, in the network, I think one of the shared values is open source, right? And I do feel like because we now have all of these communities that are sort of converging, that open source gets a lot more power and a lot more opportunity to show how it can succeed, and how and how business can even emerge from open source ideas, right, or open source files or whatever. So I think that's one value we share, and I think that's one way that we are, at least I am seeing, that's a change that I am seeing. I'm seeing much more open source activity and a much more acceptance of it, and a sharing that we couldn't do before, right? I also think that, as you were saying, one of the values is how can we put our collective minds toward, to work on the big challenges. And we do see in the network, certainly in the Fab Lab Network, and I think, I've seen it in the maker movement as well, that, we see like humanitarian aid, right? Humanitarian aid is a big one, and wanting to address environmental problems, and wanting to address, food security and water, et cetera, et cetera. And this is happening here, and it's happening in rural India and rural Africa as well. And so it's it's very powerful, I think.
I want to come back to the value question, but I'm also really curious to hear your perspective on open source versus accessibility. Have you found them to be mutually exclusive? Is there overlap? And this is a conversation, maybe an argument that Neil and I have had in the past.
Don't have me compete with Neil.
but I think that I know his perspective has changed on that a little bit, but that is also less mutually exclusive now than it might have been, say, 10 years ago. Does that affect, is the value accessibility, is the value open source? And how does that affect the network and the community and the ability to share and the ability of people to get access?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think it's both.
From a researcher.
Yeah, right. I feel like it's both. I mean, I feel like not every, it's going to take a long, not every business or not every community wants to be open source, right? But I think that if you push and require them to give access, at least, right, that helps, and it helps push the initiative and push the vision along, right? So I think right now we're in a situation where both are necessary, right? I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and so I want to see Kip's paper on this later. But I do think, we all know that there are levels of accessibility, right? So, just give a real basic human example. When you think about education, we're told, go get great grades, and you go off to college or, a great post-secondary experience, and then that's going to give you this access to a quality of life, the American middle class, the dream. But what we also know is that piece of paper or credential will help you get into certain rooms, right? But most of us who have advanced in careers or jobs or even are making projects, it's because of relationships and people that you know and doors that are open. And so when I think about accessibility, even from the open source perspective, even from the technology, there are levels of that. And how do we get, super honest about those things? And how do we get a little bit more intentional about opening up the deeper levels to as many people as possible?
One thing that's come up a lot recently for us, especially as we all seek funding, right, is accessibility and equitable access, right? Equitable access, equitable resources, et cetera. And there is an enormous lack of definition around that and what that means and how you do it. And I feel like that's one thing that we all have to explore together, that we need to work on together, is what does that mean and how do you really do it, right? I mean, we do it by, trying to open our doors and offer access to these kinds of resources to different communities, but how do you really do it in a way that is really inclusive? And that's hard. That's a hard question. I'd love to be enormously inclusive, and and we work at it every day. But what does that really mean, and how do you do it well, right?
That's a good question that the audience should probably make sure we come back to, because it is. I remember early conversations with Neil about mechanical CAD, where Neil was designing mechanical CAD tools in Python. And while that was really, really great for a certain spectrum of learner, it also closed off a number of other learners. And I think there's certainly been an evolution, and the points that you just made about equity and building that in as one of the values, I think is really important. So tell us some of the other values that you think are core. So open source, accessibility, and equity. Obviously, having a network and sharing, there's a lot, I think, that you've built on a pretty powerful set of values around community and values around connectivity, literally and figuratively. So can you tell us more about what you perceive as the other core values of the Fab Network that differentiate it from other organizations, but also connect it to the broader maker movement? Yeah, so I will.
We're on the hot seat with Kip. Dorothy, where are you?
Since I actually have a little bit longer history with you guys than Dorothy does, I was in Fab 5. I helped set up the Fab Lab at AC20 and helped start the Fab Academy with Neil. Right. So I'm a ringer as a sorry.
Well, I'm going to show you. We don't want to do a slideshow particularly, but there are a few things that I think. Sorry, there we go. So this is kind of an example of the way the network works and some of our values, right? One of the things that we value is, I don't know exactly how to say it. It's not that everyone has a voice, but what we try to do is listen to where people are going, right? And hear what they want, and then try to support and uplift that, right? And so one of the things that we are that the network is really interested in is sustainable cities and sustainable practices, right? And so the network has kind of coalesced around this project called Fab City. And really it's about, okay, can we as a city basically import data and export data and have everything else happen here? And what I mean by that is, can I import design in essence, and then I can manufacture here, I can improve the designs, and then can I make a living that way, right? And then can I recycle, can I recycle my own trash from that and turn it into something else, right? So those kinds of really interesting kind of manufacturing practices, but also the living practices. So what can we do to preserve and to preserve our environment? How can we grow food sustainably locally? How can we, be sure our water is safe and secure? How do we get rid of pollutants in the world? So this is a 40-year roadmap to building a sustainable city, and we've got about 28 cities that have signed on, including Paris and Amsterdam and Barcelona and Boston and Detroit as well, right? And what each city is doing is they're pairing up makers with governance and private sector, businesses, to pilot these ideas in the city and then come up with best practices. And at the end of 40 years, we hope to have a roadmap towards a sustainable city and towards sustainable practices. So that's something that the network believes in, and that's what we get from listening to them. We empower them to move in this direction, to the network. And similarly with humanitarian aid, I think Andrew Lamb is here somewhere. Andrew, are you here? There you are, yes. So, we work with Field Ready, we work with Terre des Hommes, we work with some of the really smaller, flexible, impactful humanitarian aid organizations, not necessarily with the Red Cross or the big ones, but the ones that are really out there in the trenches and have a much more flexible approach. And the network really believes in it. And I think the Maker movement has humanitarian Makers for Humanitarian Aid or something. I think it's. Yeah, and so, so this is something that we're all interested in, and we really, really want to help in times of crisis or communities that are in crisis. And so there's a whole body of work that's, and a whole community that's building up around humanitarian aid. And then UN sustainability goals, that's another thing that many of the labs, especially in, all over the place, many of the labs are really embracing some of the UN sustainability goals and then trying to come up with community solutions to some of those goals. So, like, this is the floating Fab Lab in the Amazon, a project that they've been planning for a while. So.
Sonya, anything to add? So you've talked about a .org. We know there's the .edu and a .com. So what are those three divisions between or amongst the activities that you're doing? Why are they divided into three organizations? How do those function? What's the reason behind the split between those and mechanism of action?
I don't think it's really a split, it's just a way to describe them, right? So .edu is obviously about the educational impact, and not only do we do K-12, I really want you to talk about what we're doing in schools, but also at the adult level. So this How to Make Almost Anything class kind of got repurposed for a global network, and now we teach it in a distributed way. So there are like 40 or 50 labs around the world who call in by video conference once a week, and their Fab Lab becomes, or their makerspace becomes, a classroom in a global campus. And so they take this same course, and what's coming out of that are jobs and new businesses, because many people take this really intensive 20-week course just to develop a product that they want to get out into the market. And then once they get to the point that they actually have a prototype that works, then they go and crowdsource the funding, right? And so we're seeing a lot of new businesses emerge from that. But I think as interesting, if not more interesting, is the K-12 work. So.
Sure. And I think, Sherry sort of touched on it, but I think it really is an organizer. And in many ways, we're seeing all of the work touch each other, right? And so there are things that are happening on the .com side, on the .org side, that are very much alive and touching and influencing what's happening in the .edu side. And that part is particularly important for us as we think about the quality and the breadth and depth of what this technology and the people who are able to use it to its fullest bring, and how do we bring that back into the classroom. So I started earlier talking about a little bit about why I do the work, but I know that I'm not alone. There are so many educators, many classroom teachers, like Dr. Williamson in the back, who was with me earlier this morning, talking about how her practice has changed and the things that she's doing in her classroom, and formal educators like Danielle, who spoke earlier today, who are doing things all in the name of trying to instigate and ensure that kids are getting great hands-on quality STEM learning, as well as some of the core skills, right? The things around social emotional learning that we know our young people need in classrooms as well. And so in our efforts, there's a slide behind us, which a couple of people saw today, our Scopes website, and a little bit about that program. But that is basically our answer to a call. And so about 5 years ago now, we went into a partnership with Chevron where they wanted to build digital fabrication labs in parts of the country where they conduct business because STEM education for K12 was a priority for them. And so when I joined the foundation, as we were, sort of getting in the middle and towards the end of those efforts, we were hearing from those sites that this is all great, but wow, I feel like I'm in a desert. I have to start from scratch. If I want to create quality experiences for children, if I want to support teachers in my community, where do I begin? And so we were hearing that from that particular network as well as others. And a number of our Fab Labs, the Fab Lab in Anchorage and Tulsa, they were already engaging with young people, but everybody was sort of recreating things. And in a network, right, where you reach out to each other and things are open source, we wanted to create some kind of platform that we wanted to be just as rich as Fab Academy, but a little bit more user-friendly for the K12 audience, where people could create and share content, and then they could also receive resources to be supported. And so the Scopes project is really that idea, and in partnership with a number of schools, STEM Chat School here, MC Squared STEM High School in Cleveland, where they had the very first Fab Lab. That's how I met Sherry and Neil in doing that work years ago. How do we, sort of further equip and arm those teachers who are on the front line every day in this work, while also creating an online platform to give everybody access to as much material and content as we can. And so that's what's happening with the Scopes project, and we've got a lot to learn. Some of the resources that have come out of it, some formative assessment tools like the Fab I Can statements. We shared some of those earlier today with some educators because we want people to field test these materials and then come back to us and tell us what isn't working. And that is also a part of the open source philosophy, right? Like, everything isn't perfectly baked and provided to you, but in a maker community in particularly, we're testing, we're trying, we're iterating, and then we're making it better as we go.
And I have to do this, a shout out to Chevron. They have been extraordinary partners, and I think they've been supportive of the maker movement. I believe they are a sponsor of this as well. So they are the kind of partner you want to look for when you're trying to develop new programs and get sustainability for your lab. Sometimes corporations are amazing. So shout out to them.
Yeah, and just one more plug and shouting them out. In your materials, you would have received in your beautiful bags a flyer for something called the Chevron STEM Awards. This is in its 4th year. A small award, but just a way for us to acknowledge that people are in the trenches trying to figure this out as educators. So how can we acknowledge you, one, but then also give you a little money, right, to go buy some materials for your classroom or that new machine. And so I'd encourage you all, apply for the award. It's open until the end of June, and we'll announce it at Fab 15 in Egypt this year.
So I want to ask one quick question, then hand it over to the audience for 10 minutes or so of audience Q&A. What does the world look like in 5 years if you're successful? What do you want the world to look like? I'm dialing back to hang out with you in India for Fab 5 and thinking what the network was then and how far things have progressed in the 10 years since we first had lots of great food in Pune, India. So what should the world look like at Fab 20?
Well, one thing that I really want to see happen is, this happens in other places in the world, especially in developing world contexts, which is kind of interesting. It's a flip in a way, but in the United States, our funders and our governance structure does not understand what we all do, right? And they don't understand how important this is, like, to the future of education, to the future of commerce, et cetera, especially when you think about the technology, the rapid development of technology, and how unresponsive our educational systems are to that, and how unresponsive our training systems are in schools, et cetera. So I would say success to us in 2020 would look like everybody's throwing money at all of you. That's part of it. And that we would really, really see this as a core approach to education and training across the United States.
And for me, I'm going to have you forward slide to that micro community development project. Yeah. And so for me, I think it's like one more, Sherry. Or I'm not sure what. No, that's not it. Yeah. And so for me, it's about those levels of access that I mentioned earlier, right? Like you get the college degree, and now you got to get the people that you know, the human capital. And so for me, it's about people having accessibility by meeting them where they are, like in many terms. And so whether you're a teacher, a 5-year-old kid, a 75-year-old senior, whether I'm walking down the street in San Francisco or Dubai, if I say maker, if I say fab, you know what I'm talking about. And you've had some kind of personal experience with that. And I don't think that's going to be able to happen in all organized traditional structures and institutions. I think that's going to also happen from a community kind of groundswell, but starting to happen in different and unusual spaces and places. And so one way that we're working on that right now is a micro community development project called Fab House, where in Cleveland, where I'm from, and I still get to live, we're really hit by the housing crisis, like many communities across the U.S. And there are abandoned homes and blight in a lot of communities that really need this community and really need what it is that we know. And so how do we start to show up in those places? And so we've got this project Fab House that's about that. We're repurposing a residential home into a mini Fab Lab and a co-work space, but we're also maintaining some of the residential, and so the community grows in this intellectual capital because people like you get to show up and stay there, right? And be a part of that community, and neighbor to neighbor start to teach other people what you know so that they can pursue some of the things that we know we need to solve in the greater world. And so I think really getting creative and really tapping into unique spaces where we can go find those people who aren't going to show up in our labs, no matter, where they are, how much, open access hours we have. And so for me, that's what it looks like in the future.
I have one more. I wanted to, sorry, this is it. Let's go back to this one. So this is an example of one community that I would love to see, I would love to see this idea scale. So in Pueblo, Mexico, there is a Catholic university that has invested in a makerspace writ large, right? A makerspace or a Fab Lab writ large. It's like almost a small scale manufacturing facility. And what they've done is they've targeted the very small and impoverished family enterprises in that community. And what they're doing is they're bringing them into the lab. They're teaching them very simple digital fabrication skills. So the one example that I'm going to show you here is a chocolate maker. You see chocolates out in the street, and all the chocolates on all the little stands and tables look exactly alike. There's no differentiation. And so what they taught this young woman to do was to create a box, packaging, something that she could design and make on a laser cutter really fast. She did this. Her business increased 700-fold in 6 months. And she now employs 8 family members. And they're doing this this is like a 3 or 4 year experiment in essence, and they're affecting about 350 families in the community, which is extraordinarily impactful, right? That's a really wonderful thing to bring that kind of economic opportunity to the community. And it's just the simple stuff, you know, it's not even the deep stuff, right? It's as simple as design and packaging in this case, right? So I would love to see that kind of impact across the United States. I think that would make heads turn, right? Wouldn't it?
All right, so thank you for those answers so far, and we want to make sure there's an opportunity for audience questions. I will run around with the microphone to people who have their hand up, and that's how we'll make this work, so that we can capture the questions on the recording. So raise your hand with questions. If there are no questions, then that makes this easy. All right. You just want to see me run.
Just going back to the question about open source and accessibility. Obviously, I know, wanted to avoid that question, but I'm also I want to direct it to you as well, and sort of go back to the panelists too. What is your take? What are your thoughts?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to answer that question because I'm the.
Yes, you are.
I'll very quickly. That example that I gave of Neil Gershenfeld being really interested in Python tools for CAD programming, that specifically filtered out kids who thought more physically and tangibly as they were trying to make physical objects, and filtered in kids who were much more interested in learning how to program. The alternative was SolidWorks, which is a $2,000-$3,000 program. So in some ways very inaccessible because it's expensive, but very accessible because the interface was really intuitive for people making mechanical objects. And today, in the Fab Network, SolidWorks is one of the tools, as is Autodesk Inventor. And it's taken a little bit of time to recognize that sometimes things that are open source, like Python, are not necessarily accessible. And that we have to look at both aspects of accessibility, both the availability and ability to purchase and access it versus its usability. So that's
very fair. We agree.
That wasn't a very good question for the panel, but next questions. They're not allowed to be directed at me.
Thank you, sir. Hey, I'm on the Auckland Fab City working group, and one of the things that we've been kind of struggling with, and I'm just curious if you can give us some insight, it feels like, as far as I can tell, all of us in our various Fab City experiments are kind of reaching in the dark, and I have yet to find anything that feels like a reproducible template of any sort. I'm wondering if such a thing exists but hasn't made it to the website, or if there's some sense of where that's going, if you can elaborate on that.
No. Sadly, no. We're all in the same boat, but what we're starting to do is get funding to take the research ideas and then pilot and scale them. And so the idea is that over time we will, publish whatever works, right? And that at the end of 40 years we'll have this wonderful playbook, right, for how do you have a sustainable city. But no, we don't yet, and we're just like you, but the funding is starting to come. And the momentum to really invest in it. So that's kind of exciting. I'm sorry not to have a better answer, but.
But it's also good feedback.
How do we get that funding?
Well, in Europe, the European Union, the European Commission is investing, and they have. And then we are starting to see. I can't talk about it yet, but we're starting to see. Foundations here in the States that want to invest in it, but they are foundations that are local in a way. I mean, they might be national foundations, but they're very interested in their community, their specific community. So if you're willing to invest and pilot in that community, you're going to have better luck.
Thank you for the conversation. One of the conversations we've been having here at NOMCON, and I've been part of it as my role at Field Ready, is about disaster response and domestic disaster response in the US. And we're talking about sort of creating a network within the NOMCON community, the Nation of Makers community, around supporting domestic disaster response in various different ways. which is a bit weird for me because, as you can probably tell, I'm British. We don't really have disasters other than Brexit. But one of the things that's already on our minds, just from the session before lunch to now, is how do you fund a network? It's quite easy to fund an organization in some ways, grant writing and so on, but funding a network and distributing funding around a network, that strikes me as something that you've been doing for a while now. And whether with the Scopes DF project, with awards and so on, or some of the other activities in terms of supporting the development of Fab Labs. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on funding networks.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you're right. I mean, we see our role at the Fab Foundation. Our role is to help provide resources for movements like humanitarian aid that the community is interested in, and so we've had some success like with the Chevron Labs, right? And we've had some success with Scopes. And we are now starting to have some success with Fab Cities. So we see ourselves as kind of like, organizations can give to us because they trust the fact that we're a big, not big, but that we have financial, credibility, and that that we're not going to mistreat or we're going to communicate in the right ways, right? So as we get that funding, then what we want to do is funnel it back out to these wonderful, amazing projects. And we do see that as part of our responsibility in essence. And that's what the network seems to want, right? I mean, when we started the Fab Foundation back in 2009, it was a complete failure because we said, oh, but this is what you need. Oh, this is what you need. And they said, we don't need you, right? But as we started to really listen and follow where our community was going, then we figured it out, right?
No, I was just echoing the same thing. It's a bit facilitation, a bit stewardship, just in the way it occurs. Yes, sir.
We'll take one last question. I think we are running a little short on time, but.
Hi, I'm Richard Seville. I have a question about this wonderful map with 5,000 points. Around the world, all shapes and sizes, levels of capacity. I'm imagining on just a rough average, there's 100 people closely associated with each of those nodes. Let's just say on a very rough average. So you've got 500,000 fairly dedicated people that are kind of marching to the same drumbeat. Any ideas or thoughts, maybe what's coming down the road over the next 3 to 5 years on what the catalysts might be to really spark or activate this kind of network into a more cohesive whole that's sort of self-recognizing?
That's hard. We do feel like in some ways we have a pretty coherent network. We get together once a year somewhere, and then we have regional networks that get together. And the idea is that you share knowledge and you form your collaborations and you share best practices. But you're right. I mean, as we get, I actually don't think it's hard to ignite the community. What is really hard is to give them pathways and platforms so that they can collaborate easily. That's really hard, and we have not figured that out yet. We have platforms that we're working on and that we're trying, but they don't work yet. But it feels to me like the community knows kind of what they're interested in and what they want to do and where they want to have impact, but it's really hard for them to work together. And it's not because they don't want to work together, but what are the pathways? What's the on-ramp, right? And so I feel like that's one of the things that we need to do, at least the Fab Foundation would like to be able to do, is provide some of those on-ramps so that you can now really make the impact that you want to, right?
Yeah. I was just thinking from this whole notion of, I heard key in that spark cohesion, and I think the cohesion is around the values, but how those values play out in projects and in activity, it's okay if they look different, right? because where you are in your place and time as a space versus another, or where your local contextual needs are going to vary. And I think that's okay. I mean, I think that's also a part of the magic and what it is we're all trying to do.
So we've added, rolled into the next session by about 15 minutes, so I appreciate everybody's engagement. Oh, apparently Raffle. Should someone
Yes.
have
And
Dorothy do
actually,
this?
I was going to see, because I did want to acknowledge, thinking of network and network spread, we've got labs here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I don't see Michael Stone anymore, so maybe Sue or Kristen can stand in for him. If one of you could walk up to the podium, please. But thinking about networks and spread, this is a community that is really taking education on. And in the next year or so, we'll probably have some version of 20 to 25 labs in schools. And so this is a nice example of what's possible when a community of policymakers and educators all do get cohesive about one of the priorities. So if one of you lovely ladies would shake it up and pick a winner for us.
So we're giving away this vinyl cutter, and it was generously donated by Roland, which has also been a great partner and supporter of the maker movement in general. So who is the lucky person?
Their card is black and green, and it says vector space.
Vector space? Yeah, vector space. Hey,
Elise
there we go.
Spontarelli.
Elise sponsor. Yeah,
Yes. Elise Spontarelli.
I think that is her, so
Congratulations.
give her a hand. So just please go make some great stuff with kids and share it with the world.
And Sherry, Sonya, thank you so much. I'm sorry we had to cut the Q&A a little shorter than we'd like, but please find them and ask more questions as the event continues. And thank
Thanks,
you all again.
everybody.